Alright, everybody, welcome to another Developer Livecast here on the Game Wisdom YouTube channel. As always, I am Josh Bycer, and we got a great one for you tonight. We're going to be discussing the challenge of getting feel right in your video games. That ability to let other people enjoy your games and not just you as the game developer. And this touches a lot of different aspects from quality of life, UI, and control scheme design. And joining me tonight to help me discuss this, he is the co-founder of the indie development studio Quantum Soup. Please welcome Chris Payne.
Hi everyone.
Hey Chris, it's great to have you on. How are you doing today?
I'm good, thanks.
I know we are recording this, it's the first week of April, and weather around here has been getting a bit crazy. How's it where you're at?
It's always a bit of a mixed bag in the UK. We get generally dismal weather. Every now and then we get a cold snap and snow and everything stops.
I know here it's been rainy, then it got snowed, and now it's finally starting to get hot again. So who knows what's going to be next week? But it's great to have you on. I'd like to thank you for contacting me on Twitter. I've been putting out the word that I'm always looking for new guests, and you were kind enough to oblige.
Yeah, you're very welcome.
I also have to compliment you on the great bookshelf behind you, too. I see a lot of tortoises and looks like games as well.
Yeah, that's my collection of TARDISes. In fact, that entire bookshelf is almost entirely Doctor Who.
Nice.
So, yeah.
But we got a lot to go over today, so for people who aren't familiar with you, Chris, could you talk a little bit about your background when it comes to the game industry?
Sure, yeah. Well, I started in games in 1996, and I worked for a handful of studios, including Electronic Arts, for a little bit, until I eventually settled down at TT Games for the last 15 years, and so that was before they'd even started doing the Lego games, and so I worked for TT Games for a long time. Did all sorts of different stuff there, and a whole bunch of different game genres, loads of different platforms, and but eventually I got bored of doing Lego games and wanted to do some of my own stuff. So I set up my own studio. So that's where I am now, working on our debut game.
Great. And I remember TT games back when they were just called Traveler's Tales. That was way a long time ago. It was like, I think, the mid-90s. I think the first game I played them was Sonic 3D Blast. And they have certainly come a long way. What was the first game you worked on at TT Games, Chris?
The first one would have been Crash Bandicoot Wrath of Cortex.
Oh.
I did the Xbox, and did we do the Xbox port? Yeah, on the they wanted someone with a PC background to work on the Xbox because it was basically a PC box.
I remember playing that one, and as a very interesting point about our topic, I think I had trouble with that camera in that game, just like not giving me the right perspective during those chase sections, when you're running for the camera. Those have always been very challenging in the Crash Bandicoot games.
Yeah, it's a tricky one because you would think it's the absolute worst possible perspective for a platform game for timing jumps. I mean, there's a lot of that we could dig into with that, which but I'll hold on to that for later if you like.
Yeah, sure. But as we said, when it came to Traveler's Tales, or now TD Games, they've certainly gone a long way. And as you just said, as I think most people know them for, they have become synonymous with the Lego brand games. From, again, Batman, Lord of the Rings. Basically, had Lego in the title. I think they've developed it in some way, shape, or form.
Yeah, not all of them. There was Lego Island was out before TT got involved, and that seems to be generally pretty well regarded by the Lego fans. But and certainly, yeah, anything since about the year 2000-ish, anything with Lego in the title that's not a massively multiplayer game has been TT. Yeah.
And correct me if I'm wrong, Chris. They also made Lego Dimensions, right? Were they the developers behind that one? Oh yeah.
That was the last one that I worked on.
And that was very interesting. I mean, There's definitely a conversation to be had about the whole toys to life genre, but that would probably take us into 2-3 hours easily if we started talking about that one.
Yeah, that's it's an interesting one. The Lego Dimensions thing did uh, the key feature with Lego Dimensions that made it really stand out as a Toys to Life one is that it did genuinely allow you to just mash up all of the different IPs together and completely mix and match everything, just as you do when you're playing with toys, because kids don't care about whether they're mixing Marvel and DC characters. Um, they just want to play they just want to have Batman fight Iron Man. So Lego Dimensions really delivered um, uh, on that vision of playing with toys.
Hmm. And it definitely, like from a brain perspective, was one of the best. I thought. Just again, as you just said, you can have Iron Man, Doctor Who, Ghostbusters. I think there's like Adventure Time as well in there. Again, it probably spoke to a lot of kids and a lot of people who have their own personal inner child as well.
Yeah, I know. They're certainly quite popular with. I mean, some people are just like collecting all of the little figures just because you're getting Lego figures of fantastic IPs like Back to the Future and stuff like that. Well, Lego did have a Back to the Future set out, but a lot of the Lego Dimensions toy sets are completely unique to Lego Dimensions and have been manufactured specifically for that game.
Hmm. Now, I guess moving on again, we could spend who knows how long discussing that. I guess from your role at TD Games, Chris, I know we
hmm
talked about this on Twitter, but what kind became your responsibility at the studio, like as you were nearing like the end of your time there?
Right. Well, I did a lot of different bits and pieces for TT over the years. So I did a bunch of systems programming and things, and towards the end, I spent a lot of my time working on the camera systems. But I was always pretty much on the game mechanics team, where we had an entire team responsible for building any mechanic that was going to get reused throughout the game, and potentially in future games would go to the game mechanics team to make sure that it played nicely with all of the other abilities that we could give to Lego characters, and that way we built up a kind of over the years we built up this massive like library of different abilities that characters could do, and sometimes we would reskin a particular power to suit a particular character. But there was always something new that the designers would come up with that we would have to try to integrate, and it started to get quite difficult towards the end, figuring out how to map everything to buttons, especially with characters like Superman who can do almost everything. um, trying to figure out how to give him all of the powers that he needs, but keep it nice and simple and just on the face buttons as much as possible. It was always quite tricky.
Hmm. And it's always challenging when you're building these games for like a younger audience, like the Lego games have been aimed for. Because again, you want to make sure that everybody can play them, but there still has to be some kind of hook or meat to keep people interested in going through them from beginning to end.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, we did. It's interesting that you mentioned keeping things simple, because I think kids are actually really very good at picking stuff up. I don't think most kids are not really ready for Dark Souls, but they. We did a Lego Bionicle game before. Well, it was in the midst of some of the earlier Lego games, and that was designed as a first-person shooter, but targeted for kids. And because it was targeted at kids, we thought that the twin stick controls would be too complicated, and we went for a simpler control system. And we got poor reviews because of that control system, and because obviously we were reviewed by grown-ups, and as with the best will in the world, it's very difficult for an adult to imagine what it must be like for a child to play this game. So, but to be honest, since I've got a daughter of my own, and she picked up the twin stick controls on Minecraft, no problem at all, about the age of 4 or 5. So I think we underestimated kids in that case, and I think it's easy to assume that kids are need everything to be sort of like massively simplified, but they don't really. They just need to be able to pick it up by experimenting, and figuring it out, which is why kids are so happy with touch screens. You can give a kid a touch screen, they have no trouble at all with that. It's if they need to read hints and tips or instructions, that's when they turn off. If they can just experiment and figure stuff out, they're totally happy.
Yep. And I mean, speaking about that, I have a 6-year-old neighbor who's right now playing through Zelda Breath of the Wild, and he actually needed my help just to get through a few like the starting temples at the beginning. But he pretty much grasped the whole idea of cooking and combat. And he's like, Josh, why don't you cook your radishes and get more health out of them? Like, I'm gonna get to that. You just play it, just go about and do it.
Kids are great for backseat gaming.
But I'm sure, as you're no doubt aware, Chris, it can be very challenging to design these games around a very wide audience. As you said a few minutes ago, not everybody is ready to play a Dark Souls experience. And even with that said, though, it can be very hard, especially for new developers, to try and create a game that is accessible, even though the game is supposed to be challenging. And I think a lot of developers sometimes conflate difficulty with complexity. And I've learned that is not the right way to go. What do you think about that?
I think the thing that people find frustrating with games is not necessarily the complexity, because obviously there's a lot of very complex games out there that some people really get into. I think the key distinction is that a game can be difficult, like Dark Souls, as long as you feel in control. It has to be you have to feel in total control of your character or your avatar or whatever you're doing in the game, and you have to feel like it's the environmental challenges and the other and the enemies that are the difficult thing to overcome. And I think that's quite a common problem, is that a game is just difficult to do basic moves in some games. If you have to do a button sequence and it's not very forgiving, then that can be frustrating when you're doing what you think is the right sequence of button presses and the game is just going, well, that you were too slow. But it might not even tell you that you're too slow. If it doesn't give you that feedback to tell you what you were doing wrong, then you're failing, but you don't know why you're failing. So that's always the important thing, that control of your character has to feel completely frictionless. So that the only frustration is that maybe sort of deciding exactly how you need to beat a boss, or at least if you feel like if you are too slow to like dodge a boss's attacks, as I always am in Dark Souls, then you just, as long as you understand that it's because you were too slow, then you know how to get good.
Yeah. And I think you brought up a really good point there, Chris, about feeling frictionless when it comes to playing these games. Because I have played more games at this point than I think I can ever remember, but I have played just such a wide berth in terms of gamepad layouts and UI that I've seen those games where it feels like I'm fighting the controls. And to give you an example, I've been playing the game Vanquish at the time of this recording. And what they do, I'm going to pull up my controller for people seeing on screen. To make use of one of the moves, I have to hold down the left button to start a slide. I need to hold down the left analog, or the left button, to aim. I have to press the right trigger down to shoot. And I have to use the left analog stick to move while using the right analog stick to aim. All while I'm trying to fight an enemy in slow motion. And I'm like, how the heck am I supposed to do this? I only have so many fingers. Yeah. And another one is I've seen games, I guess, when it comes to actually putting the buttons down. I'm sure, as you said earlier with the TT games, being able to assign what command to what buttons is definitely its own small personal nightmare, I'm sure.
Yeah, it's difficult. I mean, it's an awful faff for developers to create rebindable controls, because it's just an enormous amount of UI to do something that most players probably aren't going to mess with, hopefully. And especially because as developers, we generally think that our choice of where the buttons should go is the right one. So it's always a little bit, it feels like a bit of a waste of time to provide bindable controls. But obviously, it's really useful for people with disabilities and so on, who don't necessarily have all, sort of like all 10 fingers in able to operate all the buttons. So from an accessibility point of view, that stuff is well worth putting in. But yeah, in terms of trying to keep the controls down, it's really all about I like to make everything as context sensitive as possible. It's all about reading player intent. I mean, if you've got a game where you can open doors and or climb through windows or like mantle up onto things, you don't really need 3 separate buttons for doing those things, because there's no way that you can be in a position where you are able to both open a door and mantle onto something. So context is a fantastic way of simplifying things, so that you just press A, and if it's a door, you open it. If it's that sort of thing, really helps to simplify stuff.
Yeah.
But I mean, or even really good example of that was the original Quake, where there were buttons to press. You didn't have to use a button on the keyboard at all. You just ran into the button, just collide with it, and it would press.
Yeah, and as you just said, when it comes to the button mapping issue, I mean, I've heard the same thing, that there are a lot of developers, like, it's not a feature that is easy to do, so I have it, but you're going to have people complain if you don't have it regardless. And I've said this before, but like, in my opinion, UI design is definitely one of the more underrated aspects of good game development, because it's one of those things where nobody is going to compliment you if you do it right, but everybody's going to yell at you if you do it wrong.
Yeah, it is. Many features of the games are like that. They're not even noticed unless something's wrong. So that there's so many things that all have to work perfectly together. Otherwise, people will start to complain. But yeah, the whole button mapping thing is a perennial problem, especially with games that give you a lot of choice about what you can do and which powers to use and so on.
Mm-hmm. Now, here's a bit of a pop quiz for you, Chris. When it comes to the ever-popular debate of keyboard and mouse versus gamepad, what do you like to typically play your games on? What do you think is easier to build a UI around?
Well, I like gamepad. I have to say, just generally, I spend all my time sitting at a desk at a keyboard. So when I'm relaxing, I much prefer to slouch on a sofa with a controller. It's just much more that whole sort of flight experience is just much more chill. So I definitely favour gamepad. But in terms of designing a UI, to be honest, like, mouse and keyboard's probably a lot easier, because it's just point and click. You can do almost everything by just detecting mouse clicks on the screen, whereas if you want to traverse a menu with a controller, it's all about trying to keep menus down to sort of like 2 dimensions if you possibly can, and then drill further down if you need any more depth. But we've all played role-playing games which have given you sort of like an inventory that's got like 2 rows of tabs for your 2 sets of shoulder buttons. Nobody remembers which shoulder buttons do which tabs. Certainly not after they've not played the game for a week or 2, and they come back to it, and then it's like, oh well, just mash the buttons. Oh, it's the shoulder buttons, not the triggers that will move me there. That's constantly frustrating, but by trying to cram as much onto the screen as possible, it saves you having to go sort of like click, 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 click to get to the screen that you want. So it's all about minimizing the number of steps to get somewhere, but also trying to limit the amount of information that you've got on screen. So it's a tricky balance. I mean, and I think that, you know, even really fantastic games like Skyrim and The Witcher have kind of clunky inventory interfaces just because of that, having, you know, a whole page of tabs, and then one of those tabs contains a two-dimensional inventory grid, which you can then drill down onto a sort of crafting pane on the right, and, you know, it's quite hard to, you know, really clearly communicate that your control has passed from one half of the screen to the other. That sort of thing is always underappreciated. I think when it works really well, it's quite clear. I mean, Dishonored does a really good job of having things sort of like just pop out of the screen at you when you get control of that part of the interface, and, you know, that works really nicely with their whole aesthetic of everything being a bit sort of like floaty and glitchy, in a deliberate stylistic way. I don't mean in a buggy way.
Yeah, and it's very hard, I'm sure you're no doubt aware, Chris, that to try and keep the player's focus when it comes to all these different elements. I mean, I don't know about you. Have you played like any like grand strategy or like 4X style games?
Yeah, not for a while, because they kind of consume a lot of time. I've played a fair bit of Civilization, and I used to play Master of Magic was one of my favourites from about 1990, I think, which was basically a cross between Civilization and Magic the Gathering, and it gave you like two parallel world maps, one of which was normal and the other one was a nightmarish hellscape of really tough monsters. But that was so many. That was a great example of a game with massive amount of complexity, but it was really easy to use. But there was just so many different ways that you could combine, like 10 races, 5 schools of magic, 10 different leaders, and, you know, there was like just hundreds of starting configurations. I guess the one that I've played that's most like that recently is Endless Legend. That's got more possible starting configurations than I can get my head around, and that's really nicely done.
Yeah, and the reason I brought that up was that the 4X genre, I think, has always had that challenge of trying to keep the player's focus on what really matters or what's mattering right now. I mean, I've tried to play games like Solaris, and the first thing I see is like 18 different things on the UI blinking and pulsing and telling me, go here, do this, and it can just become very hard to really drill these things down. And we're just talking about like 4X games. I mean, this can also apply to pick any genre out there, especially for games aimed at kids, adults, and everybody in between.
Yeah. I mean, Endless Legend is a good example of that, where as you zoom right in, like every hex has got kind of like a nice bit of landscape and sort of like little like animated character miniatures on those hexes, and as you pull back, the camera adjusts to be top down, and like you gradually lose more and more detail until at the maximum zoom out you're looking at more of a parchment map, and that's just showing you sort of like the very sort of like basic political boundaries, rivers, you know, and it all crossfades beautifully. It's a lovely feature that, like, the more you zoom out, the more it hides the information that you don't need to see, because you don't want to see tons of little units animating when you zoomed right out. So that's a great way of, you know, controlling the amount of information that is exposed to the player so that it's a manageable amount.
Got a question from chat earlier. Joe K was asking regarding context-sensitive controls. He loves them, but feels they can be limiting when it comes to level design, as they often enforce unambiguous environments in regards to objects. So I think I understand what he's saying about how when we have context sensitive games like that, it tends to make the levels feel very generic or repetitive. Because if you're going to have, let's say, you have to jump, like let's say if jump is context sensitive, then every jump is going to be like the same looking device or same looking environment.
Yeah. Well, I mean, that works pretty well for Zelda, having the auto jump at the edge of a platform, which also plays into the player experience of, like, in Zelda, you never miss a jump because you didn't press the button early enough, because you just auto jump at the edge of a platform. You can go in slightly the wrong direction, but so it's just eliminating a potential sort of like avenue for failure that the player didn't really intend. But yeah, I mean, I take the point about level design. I mean, an interesting example, a contrast of that is with like parkour. If you look at Mirror's Edge compared to Assassin's Creed, Mirror's Edge gives you basically an obstacle course with occasional sort of like branching points, but mostly it's an obstacle course, and you just have to mash the right button at the right time to slide under pipes and climb over things and do your jumps and so on. So it's really about whether you have the skill to navigate those obstacles or not. Whereas Assassin's Creed, because you just push the stick in a direction and go, even if you're climbing, whether you're like running across the rooftops, and you'll walk across beams, you'll leap when you reach the edge. So the game makes the assumption that you are good enough to traverse these obstacles. But what makes that then becomes interesting, because you're then not thinking about whether you can make a jump or not. You're thinking about, where are the guards climbing up? How are you going to get? Where can you go and like hide over on that rooftop? Can you get across to that rooftop with a single jump, or are you going to need to sort of like go off across another couple of roofs to get there? And that. I prefer Assassin's Creed because it means that I'm thinking more about the sort of like at the tactical level, rather than just sort of like testing my reactions. So, but testing your reactions is also really satisfying if you do it right. So it depends what sort of a game you're trying to make, I guess. Because obviously Mirror's Edge and Assassin's Creed are quite different in the challenges that they present to the player.
And it can be very hard when you're building so many context-sensitive commands into a single game, because I think one of the other issues is that it can be very easy for the wrong command to go off. Like going back to Assassin's Creed, I've had cases where I just want the guy to like move or jump, and he just like does like a running jump off the edge in the complete opposite direction, because that's where the camera's focus, or that's what was focused on at that moment. And
yes.
It's always tricky. I just want to quickly finish. It's always tricky to know what commands you want to be context sensitive and which ones you want to give the player full control over.
Yeah, that is obviously. I mean, both options can go wrong in different ways. So yeah, as you say, if the context sensitive thing fires when the player's not expecting it, then that's obviously that breaks their immersion in. They're suddenly reminded that the game has misunderstood their intention. That's what it's all about. Whatever the control method is, it's all about reading the player intention. And so if the game presents you with sort of like fairly straightforward, like you have to press this button during this window, as long as it communicates clearly to the player what button it is and how big that time window is to hit it, then it works reasonably well. But yeah, I mean, I've had similar problems like that with Assassin's Creed. But similarly, I've also mistimed jumps that I was trying to do manually, and that can be very frustrating. I mean, I'm not a huge fan of Maso-core platformers, because it's fun to sort of like leap about and slide on walls and sort of like dodge things in midair. If you can do it, but if you have to do it without ever making a mistake, as like some of the harder sections of something like Super Meat Boy does, that becomes really frustrating. I'm stuck on Ori and the Blind Forest, which I otherwise really I really enjoy it, but I'm in a section going up a vertical level, being avoiding spoilers, being pursued by some hazard, and I just have to climb about. I don't know. Well, I've not got to the end of it. It must be about sort of like 7 or 8 screens worth of climbing without making a mistake, and that becomes very frustrating because even stuff I keep making mistakes even on things that I know that I have done in the past, but because I didn't do them correctly on this occasion, I've got to go back and start again, and that feels very old school to me, having grown up with 80s video games.
Yeah, I know. For me, like one of the things that just drives me crazy are the games where the checkpoints are so far away that when you die, you just have to repeat like 2 to 3 minutes of gameplay to get back to that point. It's one of the things that stops me from playing a lot of like the Kaizo games. Have you ever seen those like on YouTube or streamers play?
No, I haven't, to be honest.
Stuff like I Want to Be the Guy. A lot of speedrunners who do like AGDQ usually play like they're super challenging games that they will have death traps that you won't see coming until you actually trip them. And there's an entire subgenre built around that craziness.
I have seen a GIF of one of those examples fairly recently, which looked horrendous, and it was very entertaining to watch, but I don't think I would enjoy playing it. Actually, that's a really good point. Sorry, what the just going back to the point that you made earlier, which I've forgotten already. What were you describing? Oh no, I remember. It's checkpoints.
Yeah.
That's a really interesting one because one of the key design pillars of the Lego games is that because in order to make it appealing to kids, one of the key pillars is that you never lose progress. So, which is why when you die, you just lose some studs and then you just respawn exactly where you were, and you can just keep trying to do whatever you were doing. Now, when we did the first game, we were really worried. A lot of the team were really worried that people would hate that, and that where's the challenge? If you don't get set back to the last checkpoint, then you just keep ploughing on. But it worked. People liked it, and since then, pretty much every other game has adopted that approach of just put checkpoints everywhere because people don't particularly enjoy having to go back and replay a section that they've done anymore. I think the only time that it still happens nowadays is where a section such as or I guess maybe it still happens in platformers, but in sort of games that I play, generally you've just basically got to get killed in a fight in order to have to restart that fight. And it's not like you ever particularly lose progress with a lot of games. Obviously, Dark Souls has turned all that on its head by brilliant.
Just about to mention Dark Souls there too.
That's that core mechanic of basically sort of like, well, you can save your progress at a cost. Absolute genius. I can't play them. I haven't got the time to do, and I like the fact that where a lot of RPGs will they'll make you grind, but you're grinding your character skills. So if you just keep on playing and killing things and stuff like that, eventually your characters will get good enough to take on the bad guys. You just have to invest the time into like slugging your way through it. Whereas Dark Souls demands that you don't just sort of like flail around killing random skeletons over and over again. No, you've actually got to figure out. You've got to develop your own skills to get better. So it's still a grind, but it's a much more demanding grind because it demands genuine skill, which I don't have.
And I mean, it is Dark Souls again that really turned a lot of the discussions about difficulty design and challenge on its head. And
It did.
I've said this before, but it was kind of like Demon Souls kind of like was like the game that introduced like the casual or the consumer audience to the challenge of roguelikes and the idea of you die everything gets reset. There's no, you're not going to be restarting right at the boss fight, or there's not going to be like a little flag right before you start a fight. No, you go back over there and you do the whole thing over again until you get it right.
Yeah, yeah, it's punishing, and I think it in an era of 30-second checkpoints, it came as a breath of fresh air, and people. Obviously, it helps that they've built these amazing, beautiful worlds full of horrific monsters to defeat. And I'm absolutely fascinated by the lore of Dark Souls and Bloodborne and stuff. It's so interesting and like beautifully written, and like the artwork's amazing. I mean, Bloodborne is just the most. It looks the most ridiculously gothic thing in screenshots. It looks ridiculously over the top. But when you're playing it and you're sort of like uncovering little story fragments and so on, it works really well. And yeah, I think I'm going to have to give in and actually just sort of like watch some YouTube streamers who do have the skills play through, just so that I can see all of the lore that I'm missing out on, because I do love that stuff. But yeah, it's definitely a challenge for people with a lot more spare time.
We gotta be careful about bringing up lore and Dark Souls, so that's another hour discussion if we're not careful right there.
Well, if we stay focused on the game feel, that's fine.
But getting back to feel, one part we were kind of touching on this a few minutes ago, but I want to focus back on that, is with control scheme and button layouts, because this is one of the areas I think a lot of new developers tend to struggle with, and probably even veterans as well. Because as you said at the start, when it comes to button mapping and how things laid out in your head, it all works fine, and nobody should have any problems. But when you put that in front of dozens, if not hundreds of eyes, it can be a far different story. So with the work that you've done at TT Games and what you've kind of picked up, like in terms of creating a button scheme for a game, like how do you start approaching something like that, like for any developers watching?
Well, in terms of the Lego games, the key idea was to get all of the important stuff on the 4 face buttons, because those, and then the triggers and the addition, all the being able to click the sticks and stuff, all of that is nice for like shortcuts and modifiers and things like that, but it should all be optional stuff. Helper things. So all of the stuff that is really critical to gameplay, we wanted to get on the 4 face buttons, because those are the most obvious ones that you press. And as soon as some critical feature is tucked away on like right bumper, it's easily forgotten, and so on. But I mean, in terms of general ergonomics, basically you want your 4 face buttons to cover sort of obviously 4 things that you're never going to want to do any 2 of them together, because you can't. I've seen some games that like challenge me to press 2 of the face buttons at once, and that's really uncomfortable, even if you can do it.
Oh yes.
And then obviously you can reach all of the bumpers, but you don't really want to be having to sort of like hold them, or sort of hold combinations of them particularly. So using them as shift controls is quite nice, as long as you only use one at a time. And then clicking the stick it's a clever way of hiding another button in there, but it's really irritating if it's anything that you're doing in sort of like basic combat. Clicking a stick to summon the map or bring up your inventory or something like that is fine, because that's it's presumably something that you could get through the menu if you went the long way round. It's a convenient shortcut, and also if you accidentally summon the map and then have to dismiss it, that's not killer. But if the clicking the stick is like lobbing a grenade or something, you accidentally do that because you were panicking as you try to escape, that's not great. So it all depends on the particular controller as well. We had no end of trouble trying to remap all of the controls that were designed for sort of like a typical sort of like twin stick controller, trying to map those onto the Wii nunchucks, because it has nearly the same amount of buttons, but they're all in wildly different places, and it makes it quite difficult to figure out what the most intuitive way of doing it is. And we had to put a lot of some certain buttons had to go onto like D-pad directions instead, which we generally didn't do at all in the Lego games. I know like, a lot of games use D-pad for sort of like weapon switching and things, but we tried to avoid that because you know, for kids, I mean, some kids use the D-pad for moving around. You can do that if you want, but we mostly use the D-pad just for menus and things, because it's good for menus.
Yeah, like for myself, I've been on my Xbox gamepad as well. Like again, like the thumbstick pushing down, it just feels very awkward, especially when you're trying to move at the same time that you're doing it. And one thing that I found for a lot of games, especially action genre, as you said a few minutes ago, Chris, when you have to combine multiple pushes on a single hand, that can get very uncomfortable. Like if I'm like right now, I'm holding up my gamepad. Like if I'm just pressing like A or B or Y on my thumb, that's fine. But let's say I need to press X while pressing down the right button, while pressing down the right trigger, while trying to maneuver this right analog stick all at once. That's another story entirely. And I always found, I won't get your thoughts on this, Chris, but for myself personally, when I design, or if I have to button remap for a lot of games, I tend to try and shift primary actions, or the big ones, to different hands. So if I'm going to be doing combat with my right hand, I want dodging or other moves to be on my left hand. Because I just find it a lot easier for me to kind of associate, okay, this hand I'm going to do all my fighting with. But if there's any kind of dodging or maneuvering, my left hand's going to be the one that's going to do it.
Yeah, it's a. I mean, there's a lot of different ways of doing it, and I guess to a certain extent it depends on the designer's intent. One of the nice things about the pad over mouse and keyboard, though, is that I mean, much as I like the mouse as a pointing device for aiming, it is clearly better for shooters, but the gamepad gives you a lot of different actions. Like squeezing a trigger is very different action to mashing a button, and then the analog sticks are very tactile as well. So you have all of these different sort of like ways of gripping and pressing buttons that feel very different, and that can really help. Obviously, like squeezing a trigger is really good for firing a gun, better than clicking the mouse button. But the flip side of that is that obviously the reason that first-person shooters are not as good on the pad is that your stick is a second-degree control. Your stick controls your turn speed, whereas the mouse on mouse and keyboard controls your angle directly, and your speed is controlled by how fast you move the mouse. So the mouse is like a one-to-one mapping.
Exactly, yeah.
And the analog stick is kind of like, well, you can push it, but that controls your speed, and then when you've turned as much as you want to turn, then you have to release it. So the mouse is just that bit more immediate, apart from being much more sensitive than an analog stick.
Yeah.
You'd be surprised actually with the analog sticks if you, as a developer, if you ever just like plot the output from the analog stick onto the screen, it's horrific. They're hopelessly inaccurate, and all of the sample points tend to. What you end up with is basically across the middle, slightly fuzzy cross, and then a kind of like a ring around it where it has picked up that you've gone all the way to the edge. But those it leaves like 4 empty quadrants in the middle where it just hasn't really picked up anything up.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned one-to-one with that, Chris, because I've said that before about trying to use an analog stick playing any kind of shooter. Because for those of you watching this on the screen here, like when I'm pushing this analog stick in any direction, the analog stick is not only moving it, but it's also having to account for that speed, as you said. But when I use a mouse, if I want to aim to the upper left, I just immediately shift my mouse up left, and it just reads that input immediately.
Mm.
And like for myself, I've gotten to the point where I just cannot play shooters on the consoles, or shooting with a gamepad. I just can't do it. Like a
Hmm.
few months ago, I tried to do a stream of Uncharted 1, and I couldn't aim for
Yeah.
anything while playing that game. And then I can load up a game like Left 4 Dead or Payday 2, and I'm just laying waste to everything in front of me.
Now that's really interesting that you should bring up Uncharted. Actually, one of my favourite things about Uncharted is the fact that we've talked before about how I'm crap at Dark Souls. I'm pretty poor at shooters as well, just because I don't have the reaction speed, and I just don't have time to play them enough. But Uncharted has, if you put it on the easiest difficulty level, it will basically it will auto aim you at whatever enemy is closest to the center of the screen when you squeeze the aim trigger. Now that, apart from being like really useful for someone with poor motor skills, it feels fantastic because it's like Assassin's Creed. It eliminates the mechanical challenge of can you get this crosshair over this target, because I've been doing that since since Doom came out, and frankly, I'm quite bored of putting a crosshair over a target. But with Uncharted, it's much more like if you set it to the easiest difficulty level, the game says sort of like, okay, you know how to point a gun at a target, that's fine. Then the challenge becomes, which target are you going to choose? Are you going to shoot the guy over there who's trying to flank you? Are you going to shoot that guy who's attacking your companion? Are you going to take out the snipers first, or the guy with the heavy weapons? And again, it means that you don't have to think about aiming. You just have to think at the tactical level, and I really like that because and it is easier as well, because at the end of the day it's Uncharted and you can soak up quite a lot of bullets, because you just duck behind something and you get better. So the whole sort of like tactical choices don't really matter, but you can feel like you're being clever and taking out the guy who was trying to flank you, and you can feel like you're thinking tactically and being a badass, even though you're not actually exerting a lot of skill. But that's what video games are all about, really, is that even something like Dark Souls, it is balanced so that you can beat it if you don't make mistakes. It's not like Dark Souls, there's no bosses in Dark Souls that are going to sort of like cotton on that like you always dive to the left and just change their tactics so that they can kill you, which would be much more realistic, but that's not what the game's about. The game is about sort of like understanding what the rules are and working within those rules, and completely mastering that problem space. If that problem space kept getting harder and harder, such that like enemies would do whatever they needed to do to kill you, then you would lose, and that wouldn't be any fun. Mm-hmm. So it's just a degree of difficulty. It's very easy for a video game to be completely impossible. So they're always tuned to make you feel more powerful than maybe you are in real life. But I really enjoy that on Uncharted, and it totally changes the feel of the game from, because you literally just like pop up, squeeze the trigger and it locks you onto someone and pop them, and that it accelerates the pace of gameplay and it simplifies things, and frankly I'm not interested in the shooting. I'm much more interested in the exploring and climbing and just looking at amazing vistas.
Now, another part of UI or button mapping I want to touch on, Chris, is what I like to call the idea when a game feels button heavy, where it feels like I have to make use of my entire gamepad just to be able to play this game. I mean, even something like Zelda Breath of the Wild is kind of guilty of this. You have to make use of every button on that game just to try and keep things going, and it can be very tricky. I want to get your thoughts on this. What do you have any advice or tips when the developer has a lot of mechanics that they're trying to assign? Again, pulling back up our gamepad example here, we have the 4 buttons on the shoulder or the top, the 4 face buttons. That's 8 buttons to play around with, not counting the sticks and the D-pad. So if you have more than 8 commands, or even if you do have 8, are there any suggestions to try and make that easier for someone to play?
Yeah, I mean, I've talked already about context being like really useful, and also things like using the shoulder buttons as kind of like shift buttons. So if you have to hold a shoulder button to crouch, for example, you can then change the functions of the face buttons to do stealthy versions of what they would normally do, and so on. So that's a good way of like doubling up on something, and that's very intuitive. I mean, one of the things that I liked about Prince of Persia: The Sands of Time, that was really nicely done, because the 4 face buttons mapped to your head, your left hand, your right hand, and your feet. So you could, I mean, although they did pretty much sort of like plan out all of the combos that you could do, they make logical sense. So if you press A, then you jump. If you then press sort of no, sorry, it was Y to jump. That's it, Y, which is sort of your head. Y to jump, and then it was like both hands and your feet. So once you were in the air, you could then sort of like you could press A to kick off an enemy, like X to slash them with your sword, and then sort of like B to knife them with the magic knife. And because each button was explicitly mapped to a particular body part, you could figure out, you could plan, well, what happens if I just sort of like, if I jump in the air, kick off this guy, and then just sort of like sword, and it would do a combo that used your sword 3 times. So you felt like you were inventing moves because the combos were predictable, which was a really nice way of doing it, and that allowed them to get a whole bunch of different combat moves onto the 4 face buttons. But then for the next Prince of Persia game, was it Warrior Within? Yeah. I think that kind of lost that, because suddenly it gave you like screenfuls of button prompts and like combo sequences that suddenly had no logical mapping to body parts, and because of that they had to give you sort of like a hint screen that there was a button you could press that would bring up the list of combos because they realized that people couldn't remember all the combos. So where it had been in the first game solved it with a really sort of like elegant design, the second game put it on a hint screen, and I the first one I thought was really good, and the Warrior Within I didn't finish because it didn't work for me in the same way.
I'm glad you brought up Prince of Persia, because there's 2 really good points about that I wanted to touch on. What you just said regarding having the button combos or your attacks make sense in terms of how they're positioned, I think that's a very underrated aspect, especially for a lot of action games. And even the fighting game genre is a really good example of this. Like, I've played fighting games where to do a forward dive, I have to press quarter circle back kick in order for him to do. I'm like, how in the hell am I supposed to memorize that when there's just no association to it? I know there are probably fighting game fans who are going to start mocking me in chat, or if they're watching this recorded right now, but that's always been one of the big killers for me when it comes to fighting games, when they go that route. To give you another example, I don't know if you've ever played the Yakuza games. Chris, have you had?
No, I haven't, I'm afraid.
What they do is they have you have a generic attack button tied to X on the keyboard, or X for an Xbox controller. You have kind of like your quote-unquote finisher attack tied to Y. And the thing is that all the combos are just about different pushes of X and Y. but they're not really tied to anything. Like sometimes you press the combos will do like a forward kick, other times it may do like a shoulder or like an elbow punch, and
Right.
it's just very hard to associate the action to the button press.
Yeah.
And what you said earlier regarding first-person shooters, I've said that as well, that the fact that you can tie pushing a trigger down to shooting a gun, that's why it's very easy. Like, no developer in their right mind would say weapon fire is down on the D-pad. Like, it just wouldn't make sense at that point.
No.
And the other point I wanted to bring up regarding Prince of Persia, the final game, the one that kind of killed the series, was most famously was the one that they kind of removed the platforming aspects, and they just made essentially an auto platformer, because anytime you fell, the person just automatically brought you back up. And that was a very divisive argument for a lot of people. Some felt that it made the game more accessible. Others felt it kind of removed the core trait of playing that series.
That's an interesting point. I quite liked the fact that I've forgotten her name now, the character, but the fact that she would rescue you, I quite liked that, because generally she wouldn't sort of like solve the challenge for you. She would just sort of like grab you and put you back at the just before the obstacle that you failed at. So it was kind of similar to the Lego games in that respect, that it was designed to give you a very sort of like rapid restart. I mean, the main thing that I struggled with that Prince of Persia iteration was that the environments were really heavily fantasized, such that there were things like to get from one region to another, one hub to another, you had to traverse a kind of like a bottomless cavern by leaping from like wall to wall, or running across sort of like ledges that on the edges, and it felt like an environment that was designed by a video game designer. It felt like it was really just sort of like a series of abstract challenges that you have to get through to get somewhere. Whereas the earlier Prince of Persia's, obviously the levels were still designed, but they were, dressed to feel like a real place. And as soon as you start getting away from, as soon as you start breaking the laws of physics to have floating platforms and stuff, then it feels much more abstract and just sort of like just kind of like, okay, defeat this gameplay challenge, and that's the sort of style that works really well for Mario, because it's a bright and colourful and stylized game. But if you're trying to present the environment as a real place with real characters, I don't think it works very well, because sort of like nobody plays Mario thinking sort of like, yeah, I'm a badass plumber. That's not the empowerment fantasy of Mario. It's much more about your personal skill at controlling Mario. Same thing with Sonic. I mean, Sonic's a little bit more aspirational in that he's sort of like he's got a legitimate superpower. But it's about how good you are at controlling him. Nobody aspires to be a hedgehog, really. But they aspire to be good at Sonic. So both of those games, you can get away with that sort of like floating islands sort of level designs. But I think when you took that to Prince of Persia, which was all about kind of like, yeah, I'm a martial artist. As soon as you make the environment so fantastic that you don't feel like a human being anymore. You feel like a video game avatar.
You feel, and you gotta be careful, Chris, because we start talking about environmental design, that's easily going to take us to hour 4, because I'm actually working on a post now about environmental versus level design. But just to try to keep things somewhat focused here, you're right, there's a very big difference between designing a place that looks like it could have worked. It looks like someone could have actually have built this or lived there, versus the crazy machinations of a game developer. They're two very different things. And
Yeah.
going back to the whole Dark Souls series, they are really good at environmental design. Like, it
Oh,
feels like this is a place that it could have been there. Like, it could have actually existed. Versus,
yeah.
again, as you said, like, with Mario, we're not playing a Mario game to understand how floating platforms work or how Mario can somehow keep wall jumping up despite not having any more momentum. We play
Yeah.
it for that crazy platforming. And
Yeah.
I think it's very important, and again, this could probably be its own topic, about understanding what the key focus of your game is. I've said this before about the core gameplay loop
Yeah.
and how that has to be for front and center. And I think it does kind of infer on our chat about feel, because if your game in any way, shape, or form is distracting the player from playing it, then you're kind of making it harder on the player to keep involved. We said
Yeah.
this at the start regarding that frictionless frictionless gameplay, and
Yeah.
how if I'm busy fighting the controller, or if I'm looking at 5 different screens instead of watching the main one,
Yeah.
I'm not really playing the game at that point. I'm just kind of just doing busy work.
Yeah. Yeah. That I completely agree. I think that's the key thing for me, is that when I'm playing a game, I don't want to be thinking about the controller. I don't want to be thinking
Exactly.
about fingers on the controller, which is what you have to do to be good at something like Street Fighter. That is very much it's a game about sort of like your skill with the controller. And with the positioning on the field, but largely it's about your skill at sort of like timing you and knowing what when to deliver the right combo. And that's not something that appeals to me. I prefer the Assassin's Creed thing, where for the most part the controller disappears because I just remember what the few buttons that I need to use are, and it's all about my choices within the game world about whether I'm going to run down this alley or that alley, or whether I'm going to try to sort of like hide here or there, or that sort of thing. But going back to we were talking about jumping right at the start, and having a good angle on jumping with like Crash Bandicoot. Now, I think Crash Bandicoot did occasionally sort of like get a little bit tricky, but generally you could at least sort of like line up going into the screen, and you had a big bold drop shadow to like help communicate
Yes.
where you were, how far you got into the screen. Obviously the chase segments where you're coming out of the screen were even worse because you couldn't see very far ahead, so you had limited reaction time. But that was the challenge, and again, it was similar to sort of like Sonic and Mario. It was a particular sort of like designed challenge for you to try to overcome. And although it wasn't particularly about complicated button sequences, it was all about timing and learning the levels and so on, and getting honing your reaction speeds. But I mean, a common problem that the Lego games were accused of was having lots of like really awkward jumps. Now, part of that was being a 3D platformer with a camera that mostly stayed still. Up until Lego Batman 2, the camera was always kind of locked to one side of the level. Now, even in the first Lego Star Wars, there were a few problematic areas where you'd have a back wall and then a little ledge in front of it, and then that carried on down into the off the bottom of the screen, and your challenge was to like traverse that ledge left to right, jumping over the gaps and fighting stormtroopers and stuff like that. But some of those jumps you could jump at the wrong angle and come a little bit too far towards the camera,
Yes.
and you'd miss the platform on the other side of the screen. You cleared the gap, no problem, but because you cleared the gap at a slight angle, you missed the front of the platform.
Yeah.
Always really frustrated me, because if we gave the player what looked like a side-on level, and then we allowed the player to make a mistake by using the third dimension that we were not really showing them. We put the camera right down level with them, so we made it as hard as possible to to see that third dimension, but allow them to fail in that dimension.
Yes.
Which was not, that I felt was that particular level was a bit unfair. I mean, some of the other cases tend to be when you've got to do a diagonal jump, diagonal relative to the camera. That's really hard because, again, because of the inaccuracy of the analog stick, you can't reliably line up a diagonal jump. Apart from the perspective issue, just the controllers are just not that sensitive to get the direction right. Yeah. So that was always. It was particularly bad in Lego Pirates of the Caribbean because there was a mechanic where you had to hop on poles.
Oh no.
And you had to land on a pole. I mean, there was a generous catch zone on the top of a pole, but because of the accuracy thing, it was quite still easy to miss it. Yeah. And that's just one of those things where there's every now and then there's so many other design considerations with regard to sort of like having to show you where you're going in the level, what you're supposed to be doing next, also making it look pretty because quite often the best angle for viewing games from is not the prettiest. So most combat games are best viewed from directly overhead, but you don't really want to spend sort of like 10 to 15 hours playing God of War staring at different coloured tiles.
Yeah.
You want to see epic vistas and giant monsters. So it's always a trade-off between the conveying sort of like an exciting experience to the player with dramatic camera angles and interesting moves, and sort of like, but also giving them enough control at the right times to feel like they know what they're doing.
And that, again, that's another hour topic we could easily jump into about camera layouts and camera control scheme, or not camera control scheme, but just camera placement and perspectives can be very hard to do properly. Right now I'm playing through Super Mario Odyssey, and what they've done is the entire camera is completely controllable. Like, it's not a smart camera that actually will move or orient. And while that does sound brilliant on one hand, it also makes it a lot harder to do the platforming challenges when I'm forced to be moving Mario at the same time I'm adjusting the camera. Because obviously, by adjusting the camera, I'm also adjusting Mario's perspective and how he's moving. And you run into that situation, like you just said a few minutes ago, with like jumping you're in the right direction, but you're jumping kind of like at the wrong plane. That I'm at the right direction of the platform, but I'm either on either side and I'm failing. And again, when it comes to camera designs like this, especially for action-based games, I mean, again, this is an hour-long topic. We really want to drill into it. It can be very hard to get that perspective right. I'm trying to remember, did you ever play Epic Mickey by any chance, Chris?
Yes, I did.
I remember the second game, I had a lot of trouble with that camera compared to the first one. It tended to orient itself like straight horizontally to basically the position of Mickey, so I couldn't see that shadow or where he was landing when I was jumping in a three-dimensional space. So of course what happened is I'm seeing that yes, I need to jump in that direction, but really when I do that, in the real perspective, I'm jumping in a completely opposite end and I'm missing the platform, even though basically my eyes are being tricked by the camera.
That's a really good point because, I mean, the platforming in Epic Mickey has got a really nice feel to it. Mickey's beautifully, Mickey and Oswald are beautifully animated and sort of like it's nice and bouncy. It's reactive. It's all good. But if the game doesn't give you the feedback that you need to use those abilities accurately, then you feel exactly the same frustration as if you weren't reliably able to make a jump or something. If those controls were a bit flakier. So it's not just necessarily having the right controls, but also making sure that the player has all the information that they need to make the right decisions using those controls.
Yep. And yeah, and that is certainly true for any video game worth its salt. That if the player feels like they're losing because the game is making them lose, not because of their own skill, it becomes very frustrating. And
Yeah,
being able to convey that is a challenge in of itself, because I know a lot of people who play video games and they tend to think, "Oh, I'm doing everything right. It must be the game that's faulting me."
yeah,
But it's hard to sometimes be able to explain that no, you messed up. But it can. I've seen people get upset. Like for me, whenever I play a game, the first thing I assume is that I screwed up. But then
yeah.
once I realize, or if I realize that it's the game that's tweaked against me, then I'm
Uh,
like, no, I don't want to play this game anymore, because I don't want to have to fight the design as well as the gameplay. It just seems like it's skewed
yeah,
against the player.
yeah. The there's a kind of like contract between the designer and the player when you go into a game that the game is going to be kind of comprehensible and solvable. So as soon as you start to feel like you can't trust the game to show you what you need to see or to do what you ask it to do, that's when you get that disconnect and you don't want to play anymore. And the games, the finest games are the ones where sort of like you have that really the complete trust that the game knows what it's doing and it knows what you want to do, and any mistakes that you make are your own. So yeah, Mario and Zelda, and they beautifully present you with all of those, all of the feedback that you need, and make sure that everything is responsive. That lots of little things. I mean, that's exactly why most platform games will allow you to jump for about a quarter second after you run off the edge of a platform, because it's incredibly frustrating to the player if they mistime that. They're trying
Oh,
to jump off the edge
yes.
of the platform. If you miss it by a fraction of a second,
Mm-hmm.
you feel cheated. So the solution to that is just for the game to just go, well, okay,
Mm-hmm.
you were a little bit late, but we're going to give you enough leeway
Yeah.
that at the point where we say, yeah, you did screw that up, the player really feels like, yeah, okay, I did screw that up. You can't. It's it's better to give the player a little bit of slack, so that when they do go wrong, there's no doubt that it was their own fault. Because if
Yeah.
at any point they feel that it was the game's fault, then
Yeah.
then it breaks things.
Yeah,
Um,
I ran into that a lot when I was just playing through Darksiders again. And like I had my hand up as an example, like again, like the second you cross over that edge, he loses all jump command. So I
mhm,
can hit the A button where I think he's on that edge, but that
yeah,
doesn't mean anything. And again, this is a combination of that perspective. Because I've played many a platformer where they set the jump so you have to be like pixel precise, like just touching your toe is like completely off the edge, and you have to
yeah,
jump at that point and make that leap. And it can be very frustrating because again, every game is designed differently. I mean
yeah,
that what I just said right there, that's an entire podcast in of itself about how much every game can feel differently to the player.
yeah. It's an interesting one because yeah, I mean, I'm sure that like that originally came about because like in the game like Manic Miner, you don't want the player to drop off the edge of a platform
Hmm.
um, when the midpoint of the sprite reaches the edge of the platform. So they allowed you to walk right all the way so that like yeah, one
Hmm.
pixel of the character is still on the platform, then you're
You're good.
safe. Um, but because you have to establish that trust. The player needs to know when they can and when they can't stand on a platform. But of course, because you can do that, then designers went sort of like, okay, well, we'll make you, you know, that gives you so much leeway with walking right
Hmm.
onto the edge of a platform that it can make like a normal jump too easy. So then they adjust the jumps so that
Hmm.
you actually have to be right balancing on that last pixel in order to make it in order to give the game
Uh,
a suitable difficulty. And yeah, and then that slightly weird kind of like standing on air at the edge of a platform has
hmm.
become sort of like legitimate part of the design. um I think it's I quite like the way that Uncharted does it, where it does. There's so much stuff going on under the bonnet in Uncharted to smooth stuff out and seek things into position and compensate for any sort of like error that the player makes, because the game knows that the player, I mean, for example, in Lost Legacy, the player knows that the game knows that the player has just driven a jeep up a ramp, and the designers want them to land it on a train. There's an enormous amount. The player does have control of the jeep, but as soon as they go up the ramp, the game starts taking over, correcting and fixing their trajectory to make damn sure that they land on the train, and they get that satisfaction of like, oh my god, what did I just do? Rather than the frustration of, I can't seem to get the jeep to hit the train.
Yes. I'm going to do a quick time check. We are just over an hour and 15 into the stream, Chris. So I figure let's take this maybe another 10, 15 minutes. Again, we could easily spend a few more hours talking about this. And if you're free in the future, we can certainly have you back on. Again, we can pick any topic we gloss over and spend an hour there.
We could talk for hours about cameras. That's my specialist field.
All right, Dracon, thanks for coming on. I'm afraid you've missed about an hour and 15 minutes of our talk so far. Sorry about that, but one thing before I want to move on to another part about this, and also for you folks watching live, I'm going to be putting up kind of the last call for questions regarding feel when it comes to gameplay now. But one thing before I forget, for you, Chris, when you're designing a camera system, or if you're playing a game with a camera system, do you prefer the smart camera approach, where the camera itself will pretty much work on its own? It will try and give you the correct vision at all times, or do you prefer the free camera, where the player has 100% control of, if I want to spin it this way or up and down or any which way, I can set it my way?
Yeah. I favour smart cameras, to be honest. I always, largely because that's what we built in Lego, and again, partly because we didn't want our young audience to have to constantly manually adjust the camera for themselves. However, it has to be said, when we started doing Lego Worlds, which was a PC-only game, we put that into early access on Steam, and we found that the player base on Steam, being entirely PC players, were much more, and also probably skewed a bit older than our normal target audience. They were really frustrated with the smart camera, and they just wanted to be able to turn all that stuff off and just manually control it and have it stay where they wanted. So so we did. We added like that ability to like make the camera completely manual, which a lot of them did prefer. To me, it feels completely dead. It makes the camera feel so completely inert, and because most of the time it's wrong unless you correct it constantly. But there's a lot of work went into the chase camera in the Lego games, trying to balance the smart camera with the player's manual control. So as soon as the player moves the camera stick, then it's kind of like, oh, player's controlling the camera. Okay, good. Player takes priority always, and we would always allow the player to move the camera as much as possible without putting it through anything. But we would never stop the player from moving the camera, even if that would push it through a wall. So we would instead zoom the camera closer so that it didn't go through the wall, and we'd do all sorts of tricks to try. And then if the camera gets too close to the player, then we would fade the player out, because the top priority always is what the player is trying to do. And if the player is trying to rotate the camera to the right, that should be the thing that we do, regardless. So if we have to zoom in to avoid a wall, if we have to fade the player out, the player wants to turn right, and we would leave that until they moved off. Once the player started moving again, then the smart camera would kick back in and go sort of like, okay, I'm just gonna, keep away from these walls and sort of like lift up a bit so that you can see ahead of the character. And I felt that worked really well, because it would generally give you the right view, and if it didn't, you could still have manual control. So that was always what the chase camera in there. I mean, it took us like 3 or 4 games to get it that good. I mean, we're going for that from day one. The first chase camera was actually developed for Lego City Undercover, but Lego Batman 2 came out first and had the chase. So that was the first one that shipped with the chase camera in it. And we went backwards and forwards a lot between like the Lego City Undercover team and our team. We shared that code, but we both had sort of like slightly odd corner cases where you could get the camera stuck in particularly awkward bits of geometry. That was always a fun one. But yeah, it's an interesting one. PC players generally, it seems, much prefer complete manual control, and I think that's partly because a lot of PC games just put the camera on the mouse, you're doing most stuff with moving around with the keyboard and so on, and you just twitch the mouse and it's just constantly, they're just constantly adjusting their view as if it was a first-person shooter.
Again, that one-to-one impact or feedback on the mouse works really well on that. Although I will say that when I play a third-person, like any kind of platforming game, I still prefer the gamepad, because I feel the analog stick works for a tactile sense, making it easier to move your character. But it's always like a give and take, because if I go with a easier move, the camera doesn't feel that well. But if I go for a better camera, then it becomes hard to move my character. It's just one of those very interesting cases. But what you were just saying there, Chris, regarding having like a smart camera but still giving the player control, I think that's the kind of system that I prefer. Like, let the camera be in charge, but let's say I want to look at something a little bit specific, let's say I want to tweak it just slightly, then let me do that. But having it be completely on the player's end, I just find that if I'm trying to focus on whatever platforming, I'm not thinking about, but I need to quickly shift the camera this way or up or whatever.
Yeah, it does depend on the gameplay as well, because obviously with a first-person shooter, your thumb is pretty much continuously on the camera stick, because you're then firing with the trigger. But in, say, the Lego games, you're using the face buttons all the time. So if the camera was completely manual, then you would constantly be backwards and forwards between the face buttons and the camera stick, and that would make it really hard to jump and fight and do all of those things on the face buttons if you were constantly having to manually adjust the camera in between all of those moves. So generally, we try to make the camera as smart as possible to avoid that. And then obviously there's always cases where you go into like a very tiny space, even on the hub map, and it's just like, well, this space is just too small for the chase camera to operate properly. So we would just like cut to a camera inside the cave, which and then so you take all control away from you whilst you're in that tiny space, and then as soon as you go back out again, now you've got control again. And I think generally players don't mind that, as long as it's as long as you're not flipping the camera to the opposite side that you're moving. That classic is that's another interesting one to solve, because if you do have to do that, then you also need to lock the stick mapping to keep. So if the player was walking left to get into a room, and then the camera flips to the opposite side, you can't have them then sort of like still holding left walk back out of the room.
Yes.
So,
oh my goodness.
Yes. So what we have to do is remember that sort of like, well, when they at the point where they entered this room, the player thought that left would walk them in. So we'll keep it that way until they release the stick, and at the point where they release the stick, then we reset it back to match the current camera. but it's all sort of like little things. Just it's about reading player expectation. The player expects that they push the stick and they're going to go into this room, and if the camera changes angle and stuff like that, then that shouldn't interfere with their expectation of what their gamepad control is going to do.
I'm just nodding my head all the way there, because I've played way too many games like that where you're walking right, you walk in the room, and then the camera decides to shift completely opposite direction, and I'm like, wait, I was just going that way. And it can be very hard. Gareth in chat brought up a really good point about the old school Resident Evil games making use of an isometric camera, and like those games, you had no control of the camera, and they did that intentionally, of course, to show you what they thought was the best angle. But
no, not necessarily, because the key thing, because I mean, the first game to do that was Alone in the Dark.
Oh yes,
and like Resident Evil, it was a horror game. That is a great example, because if you give the player an awkward camera angle, so it's a bit counterintuitive for them to do even simple things like moving. That really feeds the sense of kind of like dread and confusion and unease that the player has in that environment. If they don't have complete control of the camera, and they can't see what round the corner that they're about to turn. There's Amnesia does a similar thing where they make you open doors by sort of like pointing the mouse at a handle, gripping it, rotate the handle 90 degrees, and then push the door. And again, they did that because it creates a very tactile sense, but also when you're panicking, it creates that horror movie sort of sense of fumbling with the keys in the lock. And that works really well for horror games, but it would be horrible in something like Mario.
Oh god, yes.
If you had lots of uneasy camera angles in Mario, then this is a game about me sort of like bouncing sort of like masterfully around the environment in full control, not about lurching through an environment not knowing what's going on.
Although that could be the next Mario game, you never know. Maybe they'll go horror.
There's Luigi's Mansion, which I think is the closest Mario is going to go to horror game. But
going back to your point about Alone in the Dark, one of the things I also remember was, because they used different perspectives, you had cases where you would run forward and you'll hit like 2 or 3 different trigger points, and the camera will just like shift, like, will go this way, then it'll go this, and then straight, like all while you're just trying to run straight ahead. That was a lot of craziness there, but it's very tricky. Again, I think kind of the overarching point for our chat is that you really have to understand just what you're trying to convey to the player, and that is your key focus for everything, your core gameplay loop, how your control scheme is supposed to work. So if you're, like as you said, Chris, if your game is about being in a horror situation, you want the player to feel unease, then you can make the camera not be completely reliable or have like those extra set of controls. But if I'm building a game where I want the player to feel as much in control as possible and be as responsive as possible, then no, I don't want to be fumbling around. I don't need to press 7 buttons on my keyboard to open up a door. I just want to hit one button, slams that door wide open, we move into the next room.
Yeah, it all depends on whether you're wanting the player to feel in control, or whether you want them to feel uneasy, or whether you want them to feel exhilarated, and so on. So like for example, Sonic is all about fast movement and exhilaration. So although it's possible to cock up, it's quite forgiving, and it tries to keep the game does everything it can to keep you moving fast. Even down to having sort of like all these sort of like nice sort of like smooth like routes through the level that are designed for you to just sort of like barrel through at an incredible speed, because that's enjoyable, and that's what the core experience is about. So the game is set up to facilitate that experience.
And again, when you betray that, or when the game is promising something that it can't deliver, that's when that kind of disconnect begins to happen. Gareth brought up a really good point in chat, thinking about the latest Alien game. And yet, in Alien Isolation, they did that where it was a slow and painful process to open up every door, or even to save in that game. It wasn't just I hit a button and I save. No, you have to let her put the key card in, grab the lever, pull it down, let it count to 3. All the while, the alien's like somewhere around, probably above your head at the save station, waiting to kill you.
Yeah, yeah. It's great. I mean, the game that I'm working on at the moment it has a I mean, a combination of factors, but you can play it entirely on the mouse using just the mouse buttons and the scroll wheel, and I wanted to keep that, and so in order to keep that, I've allow you more control. All of your interactions are duration based, so you can you click on things, and after a while something changes, and if you keep holding it, then something more changes. I'm not going to go into too much detail about it, but nice side effect of that is that suddenly, because it takes that direct time, there's a bit of a pause between sort of well, I know what I want to do, I've got to hold this button for 2.5 seconds to accomplish it. It creates tension when you're doing it under pressure, and that which is great, which I didn't do deliberately, but it was a nice side effect because it really works for the game experience. So that was a happy coincidence. But yeah, I mean, that's exactly what they've done with Alien Isolation is make it those some of those basic actions a bit slow and a bit tense, to try to sort of crank up that tension there.
Let me see. We're just about an hour and a half, and again, there's just way too much for just one podcast. Even if we do decide to go to hours 2, 5, 8, and so on for our chat. But one last point I want to bring up, and then we'll begin to wrap it up here. Another major part about game feel, and I know I spoke with a game designer, John Brieger, about this in the past, about the importance of understanding affordances in terms of your UI and how basically what you see on screen relates to how the player is controlling this. And I'll give you an example that drives me crazy every time a game designer does this, and for anyone who's working on a game right now, you may want to write this down as a note. But in a first-person game where you have the left hand on screen and the right hand on screen, that the commands of what's on screen are reversed on what I'm pushing on the mouse. So if his left hand or the left side of the screen controls a gun, I have to press the right click to use it, while the left click will control what's on the right hand side of the screen. It's one of those weird, left is right, right is left kind of things.
Yeah, I can see that. It's been so long since I played a shooter on the PC that I'm trying to think how I had it set up on Quake. But yeah, that's I can see why that would feel weird. It's an interesting one. I think that definitely falls into the category of things that are very subjective, like invert Y, for example.
Oh,
now,
yes.
that's a whole can of worms. Chris Garrison's just put on the chat about sort of the left mouse is the primary button, so that's on the mouse for all other things that you do on your PC. The left mouse is the primary button, so that should be your primary action, and then the right mouse is a secondary one. So it's intuitive in that way, but your interpretation of it, it should map to the left and right hands, is also valid for different reasons. But I guess it's about kind of convention and so on. I mean, with the whole invert Y thing is because some people are using that stick like a joystick, and they feel like the character's head should move like a plane. You push the joystick forward, then then you dive. But other people are treating it as just sort of moving the camera. I push the stick left, the camera turns left. So if I want the camera to move up, I should push the stick up. And you can justify both of those arguments, and whichever you prefer. I think it's I mean, I've kind of got used to both because I have to switch backwards and forwards so much. So I generally tend to invert Y, but I can play games without it inverted, and it still kind of makes a sort of sense, but it's just not in my muscle memory.
Oh, don't get me started on the invert Y
Yeah.
non-inverting. That could start a whole war. And because
Yeah.
I am not a, I will say this: I am not an invert person. I want if I press up, let it go up. I don't do the whole up is down, down is up thing. I have enough on my mind to try and do it. I can't. It's that to me is like walking and chewing gum at the same time. I just can't do it. And I just want to point out, Chris said if it was a sword, no, before that, left mouse button equals primary button, right hand equals primary hand. But I'm a lefty. What about us lefties? What can we do, huh?
Well, I mean, that's a good point. Chris has just said in the comments, maybe it should be configurable. That's a really good point because a lot of assumptions that we make about control schemes, we make assumptions about the player, and like the most basic assumption is that the player is going to sort of like use this controller the same way that I do. They're gonna have like two hands, 10 fingers. They're right-handed, and they're gonna do this. That's not true for everybody. I'm sure there are people. My granddad didn't play video games, but he lost the tip of one of his fingers in a factory accident. So he might have had difficulty with using both of the triggers at once. There's always going to be sort of like really like rare cases, but I think if we provide certainly things like flipping those buttons isn't too bad. Allowing complete rebinding of all of the controls is a massive chore, because that's just a user interface nightmare to try to.
Oh yes, I bet it is. Yeah.
Corral that, but having a bunch of tick boxes for things like invert Y, sliders for sensitivity, maybe sort of like a handful of preset control schemes, all of those things can sort of like open the game up to people who would otherwise find it too frustrating to play because of the assumptions that were made in the design stage.
Yeah, and yeah, I just want to elaborate on that point you just said, Chris, about having those different options. Again, like invert Y, mouse sensitivity, camera sensitivity, they are very important. Another point I just want to make. Another thing that also drives me nuts is when games automatically assume I want to use my gamepad and they turn vibration on while I'm playing keyboard and mouse. That kind of stuff. But I just want to, as another big point, all the stuff we're talking about, these are very little details. These are things that you're not really thinking about. You're not going to be laying awake at night thinking, did I make sure to have mouse sensitivity tuned just right? But they can cause a lot of trouble when it comes to these games. And again, keeping with the overall topic for today, these are issues that most people aren't going to compliment you if you do right, but they will sure as hell yell at you when you do them wrong. And this is why it's very important to have a lot of play testing done. I guess as a final quick point for you, Chris, with each of the Lego games, like, did TD Games do a lot of play testing when it came to their titles?
Yes, we did. I mean, partly down to the production rate, because we would kick out a game in about like 9 months to a year, start to finish, which is really fast.
Yes.
And we were often accused of basically like reskinning the previous game, but which to a certain extent is true in the sense that we reused the engine, because like why start from scratch? You've got something that works. So we would repurpose what we could, but we would always try to add some new things. So we would reuse some abilities where we could, and then because that bought us the time to be able to add like new custom moves and abilities that were fresh for that particular IP, and obviously the levels are you say a reskin, but basically you're still replacing all of the levels, which is not a small amount of work. And it's basically a platforming game. There's all these different ways, and especially with the later games where you had lots of flying characters and things, all of the sort of like corner cases for sort of like what happens if Superman tries to fly out of the level, how do we stop flying characters from escaping the world, trying to fix all of those cases. What happens if Ant-Man shrinks and then tries to run into these like gaps in the scenery and so on. Like the amount of they were absolute nightmares to test, especially as the amount of abilities grew and the combinations of abilities grew, and you could go sort of like, well, what if I shrink and then I try to do this thing, and sort of do you end up with like conflicts where I've told Ant-Man to shrink and then I've told him to pull this lever. He's now too small to pull a lever. So what do I tell the player they can't pull a lever, or do I grow them back to normal size to pull the lever? So I mean, in that case, generally we would grow him back to normal size and pull a lever, because that's our interpretation of what the player is trying to do. So rather than sort of like stop them and say sort of like, no, you've forgotten something, what do you need to do before you pull the lever? You've got to grow. That's not fun. It's all about kind of, they told us, they walked up to the lever, they pressed the button.
That's what they're assuming is going to happen. Exactly.
That's what they assume they want to do. So a lot of the game feel for the Lego games was all about basically trying to figure out if in any given situation where we've got kind of like conflicting inputs, or the player has previously said something and now saying something else, deciding how to deal with
that. Yeah.
Still the best for the player, and it's basically just doing everything we can to do what the player. It's all about guessing what the player wanted.
Yeah, and as a very quick example that I just ran into, again going back to Darksiders, they have each one of the items you pick up in the game has a context-sensitive function. You have a grappling hook that can only be used at grapple points. You have the, I guess, quote-unquote portal gun that can only be used at specific portal sections. So you would think that I could, because it's always context-sensitive, I can just hit the same button and use it at the need. But what they did was you have to have that item bound to your, I guess, quote-unquote use spot to make use of each time. So what ended up happening was I had to just keep stopping what I'm doing, making sure the right item is bound, instead of, again, just the game owner saying, hey, if I'm pressing R2 at this portal section, I want to use my portal here. Or if I'm jumping and there's a grapple point, let me just use it like that. Again, going back to what we saw with games like Zelda and other ones, where they, and as you just said with the Lego games, that if the player wants to do something, then chances are that's what they're expecting is going to happen.
Yeah, that's an interesting point. I'd be because I mean that sounds like it's a poor design choice. I'd be interested to know, obviously, because I've not played the game enough to be able to judge why they might have made that choice, but that seems like it might be I don't know, yeah, I think it would have been nicer to just sort of like, infer that, well, you've got the item in your inventory, so just
if it's only, like, as you said, with context sensitive commands, if only one thing can happen while I'm pointed at so and so, then assume that that's what I want to do if I'm pointing at X item. And I know we are getting a bit late. I do have to get going myself in a few minutes, but yeah, it has been a great cast. I want to go back to Mike's question quickly. I'm not sure if you have too much experience with this, but how do you think like the AAA developers or publishers see like Steam these days as a alternative to like consoles? Because I know the Telltale game, I'm sorry, not Telltale, the Traveler's Tales games have been console only for a very long time, and then recently, the last few years, they've gone to the PC, like maybe like 5-6 years ago, maybe even a little bit more than that.
I think that was all about. I'm just trying to think. Pretty sure that they've always done PC versions. I know that the original Lego Star Wars had a PC version, but I remember it being in a box. I don't know when we started putting them on Steam. Probably.
Let's see.
probably around about 2005, 6-ish, when Steam started to get really big.
Oh yeah, you are right. I'm seeing Lego Batman 2008. I'm sure if I go further back,
Yeah,
it could
we
be.
definitely did PC versions because by that point we had a cross-platform engine, so um, it would have been daft not to. But our target market was always on the consoles because our target market is basically sort of like kids and like brothers and sisters playing together, or sort of like parents playing with their kids, which was why we always had that co-op in there, and also a key design pillar for the Lego games was that the co-op should always be drop in, drop out, because you can't expect a parent to sort of you can't expect a child necessarily to plan ahead, call mum and dad, and get mum and dad to commit to a 45-minute playthrough of an entire level. So it was always about sort of like, well, what if they get stuck on a bit? Sort of like, well, we'll make it, if it's drop in, drop out co-op, then dad comes home from work and he can sort of like help little Johnny get over the difficult jumps, and then he can go and have his tea. Just making the experience as frictionless as possible for the target market. So that's a bit of a rat hole. Getting back to the original question, sorry, Mike. The Steam is, I mean, it's a huge market. I mean, the physical side of PC games distribution is still going, but it's shrinking, and it's shrinking faster and faster. So most games are coming out on Steam now. It's just sort of, Steam is pretty much the largest chunk of the PC market. It's an interesting one. I mean, I don't think AAA developers particularly have any issues with Steam. It's another outlet, because AAA games have the marketing budgets to power through all of the noise on Steam and get noticed. And if people want the Lego game, then they'll go on Steam and look for the Lego game. People have heard of it. I think Steam and the glut of new games on Steam since they opened it up with Greenlight and then Direct really is much more affecting indies who don't have the budget to do massive PR campaigns. But that's getting a bit off topic.
Yeah, I know. We are, at this rate, we'll probably hit like hour 3 or 4 if we're not careful. So we'll begin to wrap things up. Before we go, Chris, one last, I guess, quick topic I want to touch on is regarding what you're doing now that you're no longer working at TT Games. So I guess first off, for the people who came in late, what is the name of your indie studio?
I'm running Quantum Soup Studios. We're based in North Wales, and we're working on a couple of games at the moment. I'm showing our debut game, which is quite a small, quite contained game, which I've written pretty much on my own. It's called Anoon: The Other World, and I'm showing it at EGX Res down in London next weekend, which is going to be exciting. It's going to be the first time I'm showing the full game with the campaign mode on there, and that's it's a sort of first-person stealth strategy game. It's actually kind of an homage to Jeff Cramman's 1986 classic, The Sentinel, which I used to love. And that was an amazing example of not so much game feel, because most games back then had quite clunky interfaces.
Oh, yes.
But it was the first game I played that had a really powerful atmosphere, because of the surreal. It was all about surreal checkerboard landscapes and sort of like sinister statue-like entities, and there was no story to it. It was all just there, and it was very abstract, and I loved that. And it had a fantastic oppressive weird atmosphere, which I'm trying to recreate. And that's the example I was talking about with the mouse. Is that where with the Sentinel you just press different letters on the keyboard to issue different commands in the original, but nowadays we can look around with the mouse a lot faster than you could back then, and so I wanted to try to streamline the interface, and so I've made this sort of like time-based thing. You can pump energy into a square to create things, and then leap about, transfer your perspective from one totem to another. I'm being a bit incoherent here. You should be able to find it. There's a playable demo on Steam and on itch.io. So if you're interested, it's Annwn, ANNWN. That's the Welsh name for the other world.
What was the title? I'll see if I can pull it up on Steam now.
Annwn, the other worlds. If you ANNWN.
There it is.
It's even confusing to spell it.
Yes, it is. I love when developers do that, and it's like a weird mix of letters. I will put that in chat for you folks. It should hopefully be popping up. There we go. There it is.
Thank you, Josh.
No problem.
It's interesting. So that is looking to just beginning the publicity effort for Annwn, and hopefully that will be releasing sort of mid-May. And then we're the next project is a much bigger project, which is a non-violent RPG set in Celtic Wales. It's a bit of a Welsh theme running through. I do love the Celts. I love the Celts. Vikings are really popular at the moment, but I think the Celts should be too.
All right. Well, definitely the best of luck with the presentation next week, Chris, and hopefully when Annwn, I'm pretty sure I just butchered that pronunciation, when it is due out, I would be interested to check it out and see how it goes.
Fantastic. Thanks very much. Yeah, it's been a really interesting chat.
Yeah, no problem. That's what happens with these chats. They can go for who knows how long if we're not careful. And again, we probably didn't even scratch a lot of the surfaces of our topics. We could have who knows how many more talks about this.
Oh yeah, no, I'd be very happy to come back and chat about cameras.
All right, I will hold you to that, Chris. So, if you wouldn't mind hanging on Skype for like 1 minute after we're done, I just have a few questions to ask you afterwards. But we are going to wrap things up for today. It's been a very great cast. Again, Chris, best of luck with Quantum Soup. And yep, if you are free in the future, I would love to have you back on.
Fantastic. Thanks very much, Josh.
Not a problem. And for you folks watching this, whether you're enjoying this live or recorded, thank you so much for tuning in. If you'd like to get access to this talk earlier and without the ads, be sure to check out patreon.com/GWBycer to get VIP access. And if you are a developer working on a game or just like talking about game design, please don't hesitate to get in touch. We're always looking for new guests. We can go for as long or as short as you want, because again, I'm sure we could talk for another few hours, but I think we both are starting to feel it at this point. But other than that, for you folks watching live, I will be back on later tonight for regular game streaming. But otherwise, check back for daily discussions on game design here and on Game Wisdom, where we examine the art and science of games. So again, Chris, thank you for coming on. Be sure to check out Annwn when it comes out. And before we go, are there any places people can check you out, whether Twitter or sites that you want to mention?
I'm hard to spell. I'm on Twitter as Quixotl, Qixotl. It's an obscure character from Doctor Who, but nobody else has that handle. So.
All right. Well, that is going to do it for tonight's stream. So, thank you for checking it out. If you'd like access to our Discord, the basic level is now open to all. So be sure to check out the link below. But otherwise, thanks for tuning in. Have a great night. I will see you all next stream for more discussions. Until then, take care.